Well, it depends on who you ask. If you ask the Biden administration, they will talk about the need to manage competition responsibly. They'll talk about wanting to get China's cooperation on trying to get some progress on fentanyl and the fact that a lot of the ingredients for the fentanyl crisis ongoing in America actually originate in China. You'll also hear about them wanting to establish more mill-to-mill ties, so having that line of communication between the U.S. and Chinese military. And you'll talk about trying to sort of have a stable and less dramatic relationship between the U.S. and China. But if you talk to the Chinese, then you'll hear about a new chapter in the relationship, and I think you'll hear some different terminology from them. And they might not want to talk about mill-to-mill ties in the way that the U.S. Does, but they still, nonetheless, both want some stability.
Will there be much discussion on the wars in Gaza and Ukraine, do you think?
Very much so. That is something that the Biden administration has wanted for some time. They want China, as during the Bush administration, the U.S. said under Robert Zoellick that they wanted China to be a responsible stakeholder, and that hasn't changed some 20 years later. They want China to not be supporting Iran, which is in turn supporting Hamas in Gaza. They also do not want China to be supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. On both those fronts, the U.S. sees that China is not being a responsible stakeholder whatsoever.
And where does trade between the two countries stand right now? Do you think there'll be any deals made or announcements or progress made in this area?
I don't think so. I think right now what we're seeing is the U.S. and China just want some stability. Trade right now is something that is a nice to have, not a need to have between the U.S. and China. They don't want escalation, but they want stability. They want ongoing sort of established rules of the road that really help things not to escalate further. The APEC summit, as many may know, will have lots of countries from all over the world. And it's 21 countries, and this is the 30th year of it occurring since it started 30 years ago with Bill Clinton. And the sort of ambition for this has really changed in recent years since strategic competition between the U.S. and China has really escalated. And so I don't think that there's going to be a lot of tangible progress on trade, especially given how the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that the U.S. has been leading for some time is really continues to lower its ambitions, the U.S. does for it at least. But what I do see is ambitions on all fronts, the U.S. and China and U.S. friends and allies in the region, to not have escalating tensions in the region, including economically.
Well, in recent years, how has that relationship evolved? I mean, it'll be the first visit to the US by President Xi in 6 years, apart from meeting a new US leader after Joe Biden succeeded Donald Trump. How different are the circumstances now in both countries?
Well, it really has changed quite a bit, especially with the Biden administration. But it's important to note that this has been changing since the Trump administration, in some ways during the Obama administration as well. Joe Biden famously met Xi Jinping when they were both essentially vice presidents, and he had lots of time with Xi Jinping, and Joe Biden is someone who puts a lot of focus on those sort of personal meetings and just in-person meetings, not just a Zoom call, not just a phone call, but really getting to understand someone and how they work. And Joe Biden really thought from early on with Xi Jinping that he was quite a substantial character that the U.S. would have some challenges dealing with. And I think what we're seeing now is that in many ways he was proven right. The Xi Jinping China is just not what it was during his predecessor, Hu Jintao. What you can do in China, just the lived experience in China and the freedoms that you just don't have anymore, the only thing that matches it is China's completely changed view or manners overseas and its foreign policy, which again is just not where it was before. Just 6 years ago, the U.S. and China were talking about cooperation on climate change, and before that, they were talking about cooperation on terrorism. And now it's not really a question of cooperation. It's really just trying to get a floor or just a bottoming out of sort of antagonism. Because as some may remember, the first few months of the Biden administration, there was literally just almost a yelling match between the Biden administration and Chinese officials in Alaska. And so right now, we're really just, I think the US and China just want to move beyond that and just have some stability and no more increased tension, but sort of a plateauing.
And Jared, how is this visit being viewed both in the US and in China?
That's a great question, because I think what we've done polling on this at the U.S. Study Center, and we found that Australians are actually a lot happier with their handling of China than the U.S. About a third of Australians are happy with their government's handling of China, but only 20% of Americans are happy with their government's handling of China. And I think what we're seeing now is this new, the Wolf Warrior diplomacy that we may have heard about, this more aggressive Chinese foreign policy, has sort of decreased to a certain extent in recent months. I don't know if their strategic views have changed, but at least their rhetoric has changed and perhaps not been as aggressive. But what I find really interesting is the views of the United States in China. So in April of last year, 80%, according to one poll, 80% of Chinese respondents said they viewed the United States as an enemy. But then just last month, that number had fallen to less than 50%. And we're seeing this in the Chinese state-run media, that the view of the U.S. is not as negative, is not as aggressively negative as it was just a year ago. And I think there's a lot of things that could be contributing to that. But I think, in my view, one of the top ones is the fact that the Chinese economy really is not doing well. And the Chinese officials are open with U.S. officials about the fact that they actually do want foreign investment, which is ironic, because if you look at what it's like for U.S. Companies in China, they will tell you that their experience is not one in which they feel welcome to operate in China. And if anything, both the economic and the political environment in China is only becoming more challenging for them.
Really interesting. Meanwhile, the meeting is somewhat overshadowing the APEC summit that is taking place in San Francisco. Are we expecting any developments to come out of that, particularly as President Xi is due to attend that as well?
No, I would be surprised if we remember this APEC meeting as anything more than just the first bilateral between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden in a year. APEC, as I mentioned before, has some 21 countries in it, and they're not all best friends, I would say. And when it was started 30 years ago, the ambitions, as I said earlier, have really changed from what they are now. And I think right now, when you have all sorts of economic measures against Russia and increasing numbers of economic measures against China and more tensions in the Arab strategic competition, we really just want to see some guardrails. I think the U.S., China, and the other APEC members really want to establish just some stability. And if possible, the U.S., through its 14-member Indo-Pacific Economic Framework grouping, wants to see some progress on supply chains, clean energy, and maybe anti-corruption efforts. But I doubt any of those IPEF efforts on supply chains, clean energy, or tax, or anti-corruption will be adopted by China anytime soon.
Jared Mondschein, great to get your thoughts. Thank you so much for talking to us.
My pleasure.